Yeah, we'll get the presentation rolling. So for those of you guys that don't know me, my name is Dakota Odgers. So we farm in Spy Hill, Saskatchewan. We're a mixed operation, cow-calf pairs, as well as we have some grain acres as well that we move throughout rotation on the farm. That is my fiance Sean and I skating out at my dad's farm. That's a 40-acre lake. About 8 years ago, we put an irrigation pivot off that lake. So it's just kind of the end of about 40 miles of drainage. So we tried to look at a way to utilize the excess water. And for us, it's been a big change in our farm and kind of something that makes it unique. As you can see by that picture, the game of hockey for me has been a big part of my life. I've been very fortunate at this point to be able to involved in two things I'm extremely passionate about. The family farm and the game of hockey. They are two things that share a lot of commonalities, good and bad. But for me, that's really what drives me. That's what my passion is those two things and being able to do those in my life. I'm a very, very lucky person. But now, with the family farm, moving into what I'm doing now with Covers and Co., it all fits so well together. And I'm able to do something I really am very, very passionate about. And I love what I get to do and the conversations I'm able to have with producers and get out across Saskatchewan and look at those conversations and just look at the possibilities of our sector moving forward and the way that we can start to kind of move this forward and have this on our operation.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to say thank you and welcome to everybody that made it on here tonight. My name's Chance Rothwell. Together with my wife Carly and I, we own and operate Banta Lake Ranch near Shellbrook, Saskatchewan. We are a first generation mixed farm. Where this year we're going to be calving about 85 mama cows there, and we do about 400 acres of mixed crop as well. I'm recently, I guess, in the fall now the North Saskatchewan territory manager for Covers and Co. And yeah, just excited to have a nice little meeting tonight. So what why do I do this is the big thing we were just struggling to find something. We farm a lot of light marginal land, and we were really struggling to find something that would work for our land, finding that we were striking out more often than not. And so, really, long story short, is just to add diversity so we can add resilience and be able to improve our situation year over year through biodiversity, right?
And building on what Chance talked about on just kind of building through biodiversity and through some of those things that we're building on our farm. For me, kind of coming towards the end, like I said, being able to do something I was so passionate. I went away every winter. As soon as the season was done, I was back home. Calving May 1st coincided with it very well. I always wanted a deep playoff run. I only got one or two, so I was always back on the farm pretty quick, back on a tractor, back in the calving pen. So for me, when it all kind of came and I knew I was probably going to be coming home for good, I knew exactly where I wanted to be. I wanted to be on the farm and I wanted to find a way to try and make this work, to try and make this system work with my family. We're fifth generation farm. Like I said, I'm very fortunate to still be able to farm with my grandfather Jeff, or my grandfather Fred, and my dad Jeff. In that picture there is my grandfather Fred. And for me, that picture means a lot. That tractor there sat in the Quonset, had garden hoses on it for about the first 20 years of my life. But Grandpa got it out. He got it fixed up, got it painted up, and when I was able to drive that tractor, I was actually the fifth generation of Odgers to be able to drive that tractor. And for me, seeing the excitement and the pride on Grandpa's face, that taking place, it just really resonated with me on how lucky I am to be able to be involved in the family farm. But for me, coming home, looking at the challenges of being a young producer, trying to get into the farm, trying to establish yourself within this sector, there was a lot of challenges that you're facing as a young producer right now. And it forced me to look very critically at the farm. I looked at the challenges I was facing, rising input prices, weather concerns, land costs, machinery costs. That was right during COVID. If you broke down, you couldn't get a part for 3 months. All those challenges were first and foremost in the mind. But for me, I looked at them as, there's a way that this can work, and we have to find a way to try and move this ahead so that if the sixth generations of Odgers wants to do this, pass it on to the seventh, that they have the opportunity to do that. And for me, it's all about being economically viable and trying to make the land better throughout time. And for me, I start to look at little things that we're doing on our farm. I took a look at the macro as well as the micro. So I took the farm at a big scale And then I tried to break it down into smaller sectors. So where am I not utilizing land as I can? And how can I utilize land more efficiently? So that led me to things looking at how can I double utilize land? How can I possibly get a commodity off a field as well as have some fall grazing? How can I get a silage or a hay off a field and have fall grazing and start to really use these sectors together? So whether it's my cow-calf operation, feeding the grain operation, or vice versa, I'm able to keep this as a system and really keep them working together and try to move this farm forward, being economically more profitable, utilizing the acres that I do have more efficiently. And that was first and foremost coming back to the farm. And the other thing that was really top of mind coming back was water infiltration. Obviously, with the weather cycles that we've had some dry patterns, we've had some wet patterns, but for me, how can I utilize water as efficiently as possible on every single acre of my land? Because I don't know when that next rainfall is coming. It could be a week, it could be 40 days. We just don't know. But what we can do is put ourselves in a position to try to infiltrate water as efficiently as we can, to store that water, hold it in place, and be able to utilize it at a later date for what we are trying to produce on our farms. For those of you that haven't seen this graph, this is a graph that was put together by Darren Qualman. Just a really, really powerful graph, and one that really resonated with me and the challenges that I was having as a young producer coming back and the obstacles that I was looking at as trying to come into. So this is Canadian net farm income and gross revenue. So what is this showing? This is showing that as a sector, we are very, very good at producing. And over time, we have gotten better and better at producing products and a mass quantity of products. We are producing those at a scale that we've never seen in history. But what we are also seeing that as producers in the green, we are not seeing that return on our farm. It is becoming harder and harder to be profitable on the farm. As much as we are producing more products, us as producers are receiving less and less throughout time. So this is a challenge that obviously I think everybody on this webinar here tonight can relate to, but it comes down to how can we start to become more economically viable on our farms and how can we put more money in our pockets and look at how we can make our farms more sustainable moving forward. So I talked about at the start about little things that I was trying to do on my operation. So beginning, we were organic. My first ever cover crop was a traditional cover crop that you'd think of in the Midwestern United States. We had a fall rye that we seeded in the fall and then went in the following spring, used it as weed control, and then kind of direct seeded into it. So that was kind of my start of the cover crop gateway, so to speak. But for me, it moved into the multi-species blends from there and just onward and onward. This year that I picked to kind of start with on this is 2023. So 2023 was a very, very challenging year on our operation. So the picture on the left was a full season cover crop. We seeded that. It'd be about June 15th, June 20th. And the picture on the right was a full season cover crop seeded around the same date. The difference in the two pictures is water. Like I talked about at the very beginning, we do have some irrigated acres. This was just down on traveling gun on the right, whereas the left, it was dry land. So that dry land there ended up receiving its first inch of rain. It'd be about 55 days post seeding. So it didn't receive an inch of accumulated rainfall in the first 55 days of growing. We ended up grazing that as we were short on pasture that year and used the cover crops in that sense to kind of extend our pasture life and to try and get our cattle through that summer with the challenge that it was. But for me, looking at the picture on the right, I really seen the potential and I really seen the way that plant symbiosis can start to work together and what it can really produce on the land. That was a swath grazing scenario that we used that year. But for me, just to see the growth, to see the way those plants work together, not only above the ground, but also below the ground, it really was for me a big moment and really a changing moment for me when I looked, you know what, this is really a way for my farm to be profitable moving forward. I can start to utilize more of these across rotation. There was some learning curves that I went under that first year. Like I talked about with the picture on the left, we seeded it June 20th. Looking at it now, that wasn't the right time or the right place to put the full season cover crop in. At that time of year, I should have been more dependent on my warm season plants, what I'm going to refer to tonight as my C4 plants. Whereas the full season, it does have some C4s, but it's more predominant in the C3s. So when I was putting it in the ground, I just wasn't giving it the best start as far as the potential. I would have been looking more for those warm season plants at that time of year to be able to utilize that excess heat and utilize water more efficiently. So moving into 2024, as we all do on our farms, we try to learn and we try to have takeaways from each year. I really look to move my seeding date up. So that's exactly what I did last year. I moved that full season seeding date up almost a month. Where I put this in the ground, it would have been about May 15th. Soil temperature was warm enough for my warm season plants, as well as giving a good host environment as far as moisture for my C3s. So really just trying to utilize that spring moisture. So that was something that was really top of mind moving into 2024 was how can I utilize moisture more efficiently on my farm? How can I get those plants in place to be able to utilize this? So this is, we ended up bale silaging this. We were very happy with the crop. We got very fortunate, had some good spring rains last year, and we're just really happy with how this crop turned out. But for me, it was a kind of an aha moment after seeing it 2023, work on their irrigation and obviously under dry land conditions being more challenging and utilizing in a grazing scenario. But now I've seen the format to start to utilize this across more of my dry land acres. And not only this, but talk about the silage, but then have it in position to have the regrowth grazing and have the cattle be able to utilize that, take the pressure off my pastures in the fall, and get them back on my annual fields. So I can open it up. I'm not sure if you can't unmute yourself, no worries. But very much strongly encourage questions tonight. Feel free to yell at me. I haven't got into officiating since I've got done playing hockey, so I'm okay with being yelled at. You probably heard it at some point in a rink this winter. So very much encourage engagement tonight. And if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself. But the first question I'll ask is, what is 96% of every plant made of? Carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. So one is free, and one we spend a ton of time and we spend a ton of money on every single year when we go to our annual crop production or perennial production for that matter. So when we're moving to the 96, I talked about it on my farm, utilizing water more efficiently and storing that water within my soils. So I don't always know how much heat we're going to get. I don't know how much moisture we're going to get. But what I can do is I can put myself in a position to utilize the 96% as efficiently as possible throughout the entire growing season. I want to try to capture as much sunlight and I want to try and capture as much moisture to feed these plants as I possibly can. Now, the producer inputs is a conversation we talk about all the time. And how can we start to put these back into our soils using the plants and utilizing the 96%? How can we get this whole system to work together? And in turn, when we go back to that graph at the very beginning, how can we start to put more money back into our pockets? So this is an illustration here. And what we're going to see on the left is we see a monocrop field. And on the right, we see a multi-species cover crop. Now, what we're seeing on the left, let's call it a canola field. Obviously, we don't see any weeds. We see a nice, beautiful canola field. It's flowering, just starting to hit reproduction. And on the right, we have our multi-species cover crop. So the first thing that we notice on the left is our roots. So we see that we have our roots at the same level all across that entire field. Those plants are all drawing from the same depth across the entire field, whether it's utilizing nutrients, whether it's utilizing water. But what's also happening with those roots is when we have that plant, let's say a canola plant in this example, start to hit reproduction, where do we see that energy flow? So we are seeing that energy rather than go into our root and forming those root exudates and building those soil microbes, we're seeing that energy move up. That is the goal of the plant. It wants to reproduce. It wants to have seed at the end of the year. That is its biological response. It wants to create seed to live as long as it can and produce offspring. Now, where is that important? So when we have that energy flow, we're no longer putting energy into our roots, but rather it's going up to the top to create that seed. Now, when we look on the right and we talk about our root structures, we have a diversity of root structures. So we have a diversity below ground, we have a diversity above ground. Now, what we're seeing is we have different root structures that are accessing different nutrients and different soil profiles throughout our entire soil. We have that feeding the root exudates, feeding the soil microbes. We have something like a sunflower. Now, as much as everyone might think the sunflower is in the blend just to look pretty, the real reason the sunflower is in there is its deep taproot. What it can do is it can dive down, it can penetrate deep within the soil, and it can access different nutrients. It can access moisture at levels that other plants can't. And now what that's doing, it's creating a highway, it's creating a pathway to exchange those nutrients, to exchange those minerals with the other plants that are maybe more shallow rooted. And we start to see that relationship happen beneath our soils. As well, we talk about energy flows. I mentioned it on the canola side, and I'll bring it over to the multi-species cover crop side. So as much as we might have, I seen across the prairies, almost let's say barley was the first to kind of hit the end of its life cycle this year. We've seen it start to turn across the prairies almost first in all fields this year. Now we have one plant that is starting to put energy up, but yet we have 14 other plants that are still pumping that energy down, creating those root exudates, creating those soil aggregates, and feeding those soil microbes. So that's what we're looking for with diversity. We want to keep plants vegetative, and we want to keep that energy flowing down beneath our roots, creating that root structure and building off that soil biology. Next, we'll move over to above ground biomass. So on the left, we have a single height across the entire field. Sunlight is hitting it at the same height. We have all those plants. Now on the right, you have different layering across all the plants. You have something like a C4, a warm season plant, a sorghum, a millet, a sunflower. It is going up. Its goal, it wants to capture that sunlight. It wants to spread out on top of the canopy, and it wants that sunlight to hit it. Now we have something like an Italian ryegrass that's hanging on underneath. It's a vegetative with the radish and turnips. It's a low growing plant. It doesn't want that direct sunlight. They together are forming that relationship. The same can be said for the oats, barley, triticale, soft white wheat. It isn't as efficient at utilizing excess heat. Now, what we have in the middle of summer, we have that sorghum, we have that millet, we have that sunflower taking that direct sunlight. It's utilizing it. It wants that direct heat. It wants that as its growing conditions. Now, that shade is providing an environment for those C3s, those barley, oats, peas, triticale to all live in harmony and kind of work together to feed each other within this plant symbiosis that we're seeing. Another really cool one is a vetch. It's a sunlight opportunist. It wants to try to get sunlight. It wants to try and make its way to the top. I was in fields last year. I took a vetch and I actually strung it right out, and it was close to 8 or 9 feet by the time we strung that right out. Now, what it's going to do, it's going to climb up the other plants, and it's a sunlight opportunist. It wants to try to work its way to the top. So those are just some examples that we're seeing of the way that these plants are working together. But the main takeaways I want from this picture here is just talking about those energy flows and those relationships happening below ground and those relationships happening above ground. We need all those plants working together, sharing those nutrients, and working together to feed that soil biology. This is an example of the Red River Valley out in Manitoba, pristine farmland, very, very good farmland. This is a corn soybean rotation is what this producer was on. They were having a lot of difficulty getting their drill in on the headlands, fitting their situation. They actually just wanted to do the headlands in a full season cover crop. But what are we seeing on the left? We are seeing compaction and we are seeing layering in that soil. We see the layers and what's happening there. We look at water infiltration. We look at nutrients. Those nutrients and that water are not going to be able to move properly up and down throughout that soil profile. We see those almost little walls. They're going to have difficult penetrating those. We're going to have the water hit that first layer, pan out, and then it's going to hit the next layer, pan out. What we want is for that water to move freely up and down throughout that soil profile, reducing that compaction, reducing that layering, and the same can be said for our nutrients. So with this producer moving in and just doing his headlands, we took the same spot in the spring and we moved it over to the fall after a full year of the full season cover crop. So moving forward, the principles of Mother Nature. So the one thing I really want to be open with this on the principles of Mother Nature is as much as we talk about some things with the soil health movement and all of that. I think sometimes as producers we are too hard on ourselves, and we compare ourselves to what's going on around us, and we feel like we're maybe not doing enough. And I think that's something we need to get away from. I think that's what we need to do is pat ourselves on the back for the work we are doing. We're at a meeting like this. We're willing to learn. We're willing to try things, and we want to try to make our operations better. So I think it's important, when we're going through this, to keep that in the back of your mind, that it's not all going to happen overnight, but it's these small changes and how can we start to move our farms forward. It's these little things that make a difference in the end. And I think we have to pat ourselves on the back, and we have to really appreciate the work that we are doing. I have missed one here intentionally. I'm leaving it to the end. We'll have a giveaway. If you can unmute yourself and yell at me that what it is that I've missed, I will bring it up at the end, but I'll give you guys a few slides to think about it there. So a living root. So principles of Mother Nature. This is in Ceylon, Saskatchewan. This is a producer, straight grain producer. Went in this year with the first time he's growing cover crops. So he put in a full season cover crop next to a monocrop barley field. He's very much into the research and the trials. We actually ended up doing a trial as a company with this that I'll touch on a bit later in the presentation. But Sean ended up going out there. He baled both these fields, took the biomass off the field, and just kind of did a cost of production analysis on the two side by side. Sean went 57 days last summer without a rain. And so Sean texted me end of August, and this was the picture he sent me. The one on the left, he texts me, he says, well, I think our trial is over. I think Mother Nature has kind of had her way with me this year. And unfortunately, I just don't think it's going to happen. Obviously, felt bad for Sean in the situation that he was in. But what ended up happening in September, there was a few thunderstorms that rolled over Sean. He ended up with 3 to 4 inches in September. And that picture on the left is from the same exact field as the picture on the right. The only difference as this to a monocrop field was there was a living root in place to be able to utilize that moisture when it did fall. We talked about the 96% and how important that is to try to utilize that as much as we can for our farm and utilize it in an economic value. So that's exactly what Sean did in this situation. He had a deal worked out with a neighbor. There was a corn grazing site behind this. And when the cows were coming back, they were going to graze the cover crop and then go into the corn grazing for their winter grazing. So just by having a living root in place, Sean was able to utilize this moisture. He was able to capture it efficiently and put himself in a position to gain value out of this land. In a monocrop setting, it would have been dead and gone about a month ago, but instead that living root, it's kept feeding that soil biology and kept building those soil aggregates and feeding those root exudates. Animal integration is the next one. It's something that we've gotten away from on our farms across the prairies. And it's something that really, when we talk about some of these soil health changes that we can make, it really is a way for us to implement these and really fast track them. We look at a picture like this that we have up there. We have this cow and this nice full season cover crop, and we look at all this biomass above ground. So that biomass is going to go through the cow and come out as a plant available nutrient. It is going to utilize it for its energy, and its output is going to be utilized by the soil. We can start to really make these changes in a full cycle moment, put this biomass above ground back into the soil, and be able to utilize it for future uses. So we look at the animals and the impact they can make. We look at traditionally across the prairies, the million of animals that would roam the prairies and graze. The same concept is with our cows that we have today, whether it's cows, bison, goat, sheep, whatever it may be. Animal integration, hoof impact is extremely important, looking at some of these changes that we can make on our farms. And there's lots of people that are getting creative. The last example we had, a straight grain farm that worked out a deal with a cattle producer looking for some fall grazing, and they were able to utilize it moving forward and have this as an economic value on their farm. Minimal disturbance. I think it's talked a lot about when we think of minimal disturbance as far as tillage. But the one thing I want to touch on tonight when we look at minimal disturbance is roots. How can we utilize roots and the biology to break up some of this compaction, to increase some of this water infiltration, and to improve, when we look at that video that we've seen, the water infiltration as well as the movement of nutrients and the utilization of nutrients that we are putting on the fields that we're looking at having these cover crops. So we look at the root structures and how they can work together, how these form relationships beneath the soil, as well as reduce compaction with things like turnips, radishes, and as well, probably one of the most important ones that I don't think is talked about enough is the mycorrhizal fungi. We're stimulating that fungi in our soils. We're really getting it biologically active, and that fungi, invisible to the human eye, is more powerful than we can ever imagine. But as well, there is, things of tillage with the minimal disturbance. We're not oxidizing that soil. Instead, if we can go in, we can look at minimal disturbance. This is just a picture from my own farm. Traditionally, we were organic for about 15 years. I grew up always seeding with the wide sweeps on the cultivator. A change we made on our farm, we went to the narrow boots with dual chute openers. We have the mid-row bander, being able to seed directly in the stubble and just reduce some of that disturbance that we're having in the spring. I've seen a massive gain as far as utilization of water within that crop, as well as weed pressure, not disturbing some of those weeds throughout the growing season. And it brings back to this video that we showed at the very beginning. How can we utilize roots to reduce some of this compaction? We look at that pore space within that soil. We are now introducing air to that soil, and we are now allowing the movement of those nutrients and the access to infiltrate water at a much more efficient rate. This picture here, I love this picture from Oak River, Manitoba. Obviously checking a couple boxes with animal integration, but as well soil armor. So what are we seeing on the right? We're seeing the graze has been they've came through, they've grazed it, but what they've also done is they've laid this plant material on top of the soil. Now, why is that important? Obviously, I think the first thing that comes to mind for a lot of people is reduction of erosion potential, which is absolutely correct. But for me, the one thing that really stands out to me in this picture is the moderation of temperature. So we're not going to have these high extremes. When we look at that, a black piece of soil with a hot summer day, it is extremely hot on that soil. And we are not allowing that soil to be biologically active at its maximum potential. Instead, it's starting to shut down. It's kind of going into crisis mode. It's way too hot for it to function properly. So it's going back and it's retreating and it's just starting to shut down on us. When we look at the picture on the right, we have that material laid down on top, that moderation of temperature. We're now allowing that soil to be biologically active at its maximum rate for as long as we possibly can. We're not going to have those high swings. Instead, we're going to keep that constant temperature, and that soil is just going to perform much better for us, and it's going to be able to utilize everything that's happening around us at a much more efficient rate. I'm sure everybody has a field like this on their farm, and this is my field. Uh, these are the ones you don't want to talk about, but this is about a 50-acre chunk on a part of a quarter section. Every year, it seems like these 50 acres are always underperforming for us, whatever it may be, whatever practice done there previously. So this past year, we went in with a full season cover crop, just tried to give it a recovery year, tried to put some of that biological activity back into the soil. And what are we seeing here? So early on in the growing season, I went and took a shovelful, and that's just a shovelful looking at the diversity of plants that we're getting early on in the growing season. So that's exactly what I'm looking for. We have those different root structures already working together in the same seed row. They're starting to form those relationships with their roots, and they're starting to have that harmonious relationship happening beneath the soil. We look in the middle there, we have the nodulation of legumes early on in the growing season. So that's a pea that I have in my hand there. And then most exciting for me on the right, we have an earthworm. And that for me, every time I went out there and took a shovelful throughout the summer, I was seeing earthworms almost every time I took a shovelful. So I knew what we were doing was working, and those earthworms are starting to come back into that soil at a much higher rate. And for me, I knew I was starting to make progress. I'm really excited to see moving forward what this field can do for me moving forward, as it's the one part of our farm that actually isn't fenced. We will get a fenced around it one day. It's the long list of to-dos, but for me, just kind of working in a part of a rotation on our farm and being able to utilize the livestock feed the past year was extremely important for us on our operation this year. Most importantly, context. So, as I talked about at the start, for each of us on this call, it's all going to be different as far as what works in our operation, what we have access to, what our environmental conditions are. But like I also said, we have to really pat ourselves on the back for the work that we are doing and understand that we are a part of the context of our operation. So everything that I might do might not work for Chance and vice versa. It's all going to fit what we're able to do on our operation. So just a couple examples of this. This is the pasture out in Lorburn, Saskatchewan. The rental agreement with this pasture is it can't be turned over. So it really can't be reseeded. It can't be brought into a rotation. So the options as far as getting this pasture producing a bit more are fairly limited. So what this producer did last year, they went out late fall and they bale grazed. When they went out to check the cows, and the bales were about half down, they went out with a hand spreader and a rejuvenation pasture mix there, put it on top of the bales. As the cattle came through, consumed the rest of the bales, the hoof impact, pushing those seeds into the soil. That's his way of kind of moving this pasture forward. So that fits the context of his operation and what he's able to do. Picture on the right, I just gave 5 or 6 slides talking about these different things that we can do, principles of Mother Nature. But unfortunately, sometimes they don't go to plan. And that's what happened to me last fall. So I had a field I was going into, and we were putting in some winter trit. I went to put my seeding depth to try and get it all. I had it all loaded. It was a great plan. It was going to work out. I was going to be done in a day. My seeding depth, I just couldn't get the proper seeding depth. So, unfortunately, in this situation, I had to go out. I had to make a cultivator pass to try and make sure that I established that proper seeding depth. Obviously, it wasn't what I wanted to do, but knowing it fit the context of my situation, it checked a lot of boxes for me moving forward. I was able to get a living root in that soil. I was able to utilize water more efficiently in the spring. I had a multitude of options of what I want to do with it next year, whether it's take it off at feed or take it for grain. So for me, it provided a lot of different options and it checked a lot of boxes as far as the principles of Mother Nature and how I kind of want to be able to utilize these different things on my farm moving forward. And just tying it all together, building off the cartoon that we had there, this is just it in real life. So feeding the diversity of plant species, diversity of root exudates, and diversity of soil microbes. So these are in some drier regions of the province, down in Killdeer, Saskatchewan. Great man. Worked hard in there out in his field, checking it out. He ended up taking this for swath grazing last year. I got lots of videos throughout the winter from Ward. He was pretty excited with how it all turned out. And then a picture on the right, bit of a different context, obviously coming off a dry couple years. Nick Patrick down there really went with the strategy to try to seed early. So he was late April, or I think it was around April 20th, I believe, April 24th, somewhere around there. He actually seeded this crop. So his main goal was to get out as early as he could. The context of his situation, they do quite a bit of grain. So he wants to seed his forages prior to starting into his grain. So he went out there with their cool season cover crop, got it in very early, utilized that spring moisture, and ended up taking this as dry hay. And it turned out to be a very, very good dry hay field for him. So a couple different situations, different contexts, but both producers finding ways to utilize plant diversity. Water infiltration test. If you're not familiar with the water infiltration test, it's just a 6-inch auger ring. Put it 3 to 4 inches in the ground, and just use a 500 milliliter water bottle and pour that within the 6-inch auger ring. Dump it in there, and as it's going in, start a timer. And when you see that completely soak into the soil, you know that you have penetrated 1 inch of water. So knowing that, we can start to use this across our farms and see how different areas are starting to utilize water and infiltrate water more effectively or less effectively, and what practices we're doing that are maybe influencing that. So like I talked about, one of the main goals of my operation moving home was to capture as much water as possible. So it's just utilizing whatever moisture we do get, making sure that it's ending up within our soils. It's locked in there. It's not running off. It's not going to the ditch. It's not evaporating, but instead it's locked into our soils for us to be able to utilize it moving forward as efficiently as possible. And that's exactly what happened last summer. So that field I talked about, the 50 acres, that field no one wants to talk about, where I put the full season cover crop, because it's always, just a little behind, was right next to a canola field that we planted. And the radar on the left, I'm sure we've seen that come across at certain points. It was a heavy thunderstorm. It rained about 1.5 to 2 inches within about an hour to an hour and a half. So I was pretty interested in this. I jumped in the truck. The turkey trail to get back there was a little soft, and there was ruts for the rest of the summer that I got a few comments about, but I was very glad I went. But you'll be able to see here just the difference in water infiltration, 50 yards apart, what the difference was as far as infiltrating water within these soils. So the monocrop field, the canola, you can see the water starting to pool around my boots. It's still laying on top. You can actually see where I was walking before some of the boot impact there. And then on the right, the full season cover crop.
Yeah, so then brings us to the question of why so much diversity, and it's something that we get asked quite often. Um, there's a few different answers there. Simple reason is we want to capture as much sunlight as possible. We want to bring that energy down into the root systems. We want those diversity of root systems, diversity of plant structures, and a lot of these plants bring different factors to the table, whether it's nutrient production, root systems that we use for things like breaking compaction, anything like that. So the reason, and also weather insurance. We want these cool season plants and these warm seasons plants working together to capitalize on these different sunlight cycles and growth cycles throughout the year. So as you can see, the C3 plants, they thrive in the early and the late seasons throughout the year where it's cooler, maybe a little wetter. That's going to be some of their prime growing conditions. Your warm season, your C4 plants, they're going to come on in the peak heat of summer. They like that 30-degree weather. Their big solar panels, they're going to soak that all up. And like Dakota mentioned before, they're going to provide some shade and some shelter for those cool season plants as well. And the variety gives us an insurance policy for Mother Nature. If we have a cool, wet season, we're going to have something, and if we have a warm, hot season, we're going to have something as well. And within 2 different years, you might see two totally different crops, right? So our full season here, the species in dark are our cool season, and the lighter blue are our warm season. Um, and it's just that wide variety. We've got our cereals, our legumes, um, some brassicas in there, grasses, and then just something that's going to fill every area of the canopy, right, from top to the ground level, right? Nice little clip of our seed blend. You can see the variety of seeds there. Lots of large seeds, but also lots of smaller seeds as well. Um, and the large seeds help carry everything through and seed out really nicely. So this is some of my stuff this year. And this just shows the really wide window that we have and the wide variety of plants there are. The picture on the left, you can see I took it a little bit. We were fairly challenged with moisture this year. So we decided to take it at a little earlier staging than I typically would. Everything was pretty green, vegetative still, but it was starting to run out of steam and just peter out. So we went in and cut it. But you can see in that picture, the C4 plants are just starting to really come on. Lots of C3 cool season plants there as well. We had a warm or a cool, wet spring and then followed by a hot, dry spell. And the warm season plants just kind of got behind in the canopy and they struggled to break that canopy again and keep up. Picture on the right, I cut that crop about it would be about 3 weeks later than the one on the left. And you can see the cereals in there are starting to ripen off. You're starting to see things change color a little bit, but also in the bottom part of that canopy and also throughout the canopy, you're seeing a lot of green vegetative plants still. So you still wind up with a nice balance and a flexibility in that harvest window.
Chance, I really like how that picture on the left there, you can actually see your C4s just hanging on underneath. If you kind of look
Yes.
along the line of where you cut, and you can see exactly kind of what you're talking about of how those are almost stunted a little bit, just based on the environmental conditions that we had this year.
Absolutely. And once they got behind in that canopy, they just struggled to get that solar panel up and out. And I found once we cut that crop, those C4 plants really showed in the regrowth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They just had access to sunlight when they just didn't before. Those C3s were in their prime time growing conditions, and they just kind of took it from them.
Once again, just showing that variety here. Picture on the left, this was early in the season. Things were looking really good. This is kind of before the tap turned off. Things were just starting to canopy out, and you can see lots of that. The variety we're seeing lots of the light green there. The C4 plants are coming, but also down in the canopy we've got lots of C3s going there as well. Um, Come over to the other one, we had an earlier seeded crop, and you see that dark green in there. Those C3s are really thriving, and you know it's the same blend. It was both full season blend seeded, but you can just see the difference in the year and the difference in the timing as to what you're going to get for a crop through the year. This is a really cool one. This is the full season cover crop seeded out in Debden. This is a couple years ago. Um, and you can just see here, they seeded it early. It was seeded in May. And the C3s, the cool season, the vetch, the peas, the oats, um, and in the whole canopy, it was hard to walk through. But it just came on like crazy, the cool season plants. But the following year after this, they seeded silage corn with the soybeans intercropped into it. Um, they left a 70 by 200 strip without any fertilizer, and Reynolds said, "I don't need to flag that. I'll just we'll be able to see it. We'll be able to see a wave in the corn." So they came back to it throughout the year, and they could not find their test strip. When the custom choppers came in, they could not. He told his chopper to watch for this test strip that they had left without any fertilizer. They couldn't find it. The entire crop went right around that 21 ton to the acre with the corn and the beans, and and it was just really interesting to see how much nutrition or nutrients that this cover crop the previous year had fixed, and gave that corn even where they hadn't fertilized a good feed, right? This is another one. I did a little time lapse photo here throughout the season. This one was seeded late. It was seeded on the 4th of July. And this just shows how rapidly this crop can grow given the conditions. As you can see in the pictures, they're taken just about exactly a month apart. So picture on the left, warm season, full season seeded side by side. I'm at the partition in the field where I've got my measuring stick. It was 2 feet tall on August 8th. And I came back same day every week and I took a staging picture. So 4 weeks apart, and the picture on the right, that had grown a foot a week. It's 6 feet tall in that picture. And it went almost 7 bales to the acre, 1,800 pound silage bales. And it's the first time that this fella had ever plugged the crimpers on his disc bind. So he was having lots of fun out there. So learning as we go, just it's so adaptable, and we have a lot of options with a crop like this. So if things do go sideways, and they sure do, this is Dakota's picture on the left here. Had some trouble with their pre-burn, and they didn't get the kill that they wanted to. Started seeing more weeds than they wanted to, and wound up saying, "Hey, we're gonna put the cows in there. We're gonna graze it off before these weeds have a chance to go to seed," and really were able to capture the value out of it in that way versus being unhappy with the crop overall. Um, the other thing is, there's other options other than just a multi-species. Picture on the right, we can add something as simple as Italian ryegrass into an oat crop. Um, Winter triticale with wheat. Just adding another species in there, keeping that living root longer in the year, and being able to capitalize on taking in some more sunlight and growing conditions on a different species after one has completed its cycle.
Yeah, I'll just add to that Italian ryegrass there, Chance. It was the first year that we've done it on our farm, and it definitely won't be the last one. Picture on the left, maybe not a good learning scenario, but you utilize, you do what you can on a situation like that. And we just wanted to try and get everything while it's vegetative and try to control the weed seed bank, and kind of look at it for next year there. And we ended up grazing it 2 or 3 times last summer, actually. No, so it worked out well. But on the right there, the Italian ryegrass worked out very well. So we just went in. We ended up doing 5 pounds of Italian ryegrass, standard seeding rate on our oats, combine the oats, let it regrow for a week after combining and baling the straw. And then we actually turned 52 animals out there for 3 weeks on this 50-acre chunk. Opened the gate up, they left for a week, and we're right back in there. An extremely long, late growing season plant. But the nice thing about some of these combinations, like an oats and Italian ryegrass, we did not change our herbicide for our oats. So we still got weed control in that year. The similar option exists kind of with what Chance was talking about, was still having some herbicide options, even in a grain setting.
Yeah, and you're able to check a couple of boxes. You're still able to pull off your cash crop, and then you're able to turn those animals out, get that livestock integration, and return some nutrients to the land, right?
Absolutely.
Those are happy cows.
They are very happy. Yeah.
So this is our piece of land this year. So it's a full season cover crop. What we did is we put a double hot wire around it. We got about an inch of rain following our harvest, cutting and baling this regrowth, and we immediately noticed it starting to regrow quite vigorously, right? So we put up a hot wire and we utilized this as our fall grazing this year. As our pastures tired out, we brought groups of cows home and we kicked them onto this regrowth grazing. Italian ryegrass came back quite thick. We had some sorghum. We had our brassicas, our turnips, our radishes were coming back quite a bit. Put some big tops on again. Saw a lot of varieties come back, but the Italian ryegrass kind of dominated what we saw there, um, but also large variety. Um, I firmly believe, and I mean we've taken a few tests in a few spot or some regrowth testing we took down at Asquith, clippings and just crazy high protein on it, right? Um, so for me at this point in the year, our pasture land is getting tired. Our grass is not growing. It's probably low quality what they're eating then. This regrowth grazing, it provides an opportunity for extremely high quality grazing at that point in the year. And if conditions exist, it can provide significant value to your cover crop, and being able to capture, quite a few grazing days out of it. And it gives you that opportunity, like we just covered, take your cash crop off and still be able to put the livestock onto the land and that integration, right?
It actually almost went the other way in Asquith, where we almost needed some like a straw or stockpiled grass because it was so rich.
For sure. Yeah.
And not that it'll be like that in every year, every situation, but just case by case. It was an extremely lush green field late into the fall, where actually probably in that situation, some straw or some stockpiled grass would go very well just to balance those animals out a bit.
Some out. Yeah.
I'll kind of jump in here. So what I'm going to kind of talk about is seeding date and soil temperature. So it's going to be really important. I talked about the mistake I made the first year that I put the full season in, and just utilizing our cool season and our warm season plants. Chance kind of illustrated that graph and did a great job of explaining it, of when we're kind of looking at these ideal windows of when we want to utilize these plants. The best way I can explain it, and I think probably a lot of people resonate with, is looking at something like a C3 crop, a beautiful oat, barley, green feed crop, silage crop. We've all seen it. And that summer heat hits and it just turns. And we're rushing to get out there as fast as we can because we're losing quality by the day. That is just showing that C3 crop. It's just not, as effective in those high heat conditions as something like a C4 crop is, as far as utilizing water and withstanding that heat. So that's going right back to that graph Chance was showing. but that's why we're looking to build off diversity. So when we look at something seeded early, all these pictures coming up are a full season cover crop. So they have a mix of cool season C3 plants and warm season C4 plants. We look at this cool season crop or this full season crop that was seeded here at 2 degrees soil temperature. So ideally for a full season cover crop, we're looking between 6 to 10 degrees soil temperature. A warm season cover crop, we're looking at 10 degrees soil temperature. And a cool season, we're looking to get out there as early as we can. Those plants have some frost tolerance. They're meant to be seeded early. So this situation here with the full season cover crop seeded, those warm seasons just never would have had a chance. It just would have been too cool. They would have, with warm season plants as well, they almost have no frost tolerance, zero frost tolerance really. So if there was a light frost that came through, it would have took those warm season plants. And also the soil temperature was just too cool to really give a good chance to have all those warm seasons germinate and get going. And like we've talked about throughout, capture that sunlight. So this here, a full season, that essentially is a cool season. So at that point, if you're thinking about going this early, if you want to take advantage of that spring moisture, I think it's a great idea, but you're better off save yourself some headaches and go with a cool season cover crop. That's going to be your best bet because those are the plants that you're going to see. That's exactly what Joe did. I got a phone call from Joe. For those of you guys that don't know Joe, Joe is one of the co-founders of Covers and Co. Joe was traditionally a mixed farm, grain and cows. But last spring, Joe gave me a call and told me that he bought 200 bred cows. So he quickly turned into cow heavy. So he was going across his annual crop acres and putting in cover crops as early as he possibly could because that's what he was utilizing as his pasture for the summer. So this is him, putting the cows out there. This would have been a cool season cover crop seeded very early in the spring, utilizing that spring moisture very effectively, getting a plant established, having that living root in the soil for as many days as possible. And this is the end result. Those cattle are able to get out there, utilize that within the pasture. This was the last paddock that Joe actually grazed on his farm. As you can see, this is getting a bit mature. I think he was actually having a hard time keeping up just with some of the growth that was happening and getting those animals through at a high enough rate. But I think the cool season for me is really one of the most underutilized crops in Western Canada. I look at myself, and we have some light sandy land, and something that, it'll always look really good in June, but come July, that high heat hits, that sand wants to dry out. If I can move that up 3 weeks, if I could get out there start of May, end of April, and I can have that crop almost filled by the time July hits, and I'm just cutting and utilizing it as a forage source and just having that living root there to give some shade, give that protection for some of that lighter land. I'm going to be able to utilize whatever moisture does come, whether it's a thunderstorm in July, to be able to have that regrowth and be able to utilize it for a fall grazing situation. I look at the cool season as a great fit for light land that's really prone to burning up in the summer. If we're experiencing some dry weather patterns in our area, one of the big trade-offs, like I kind of mentioned with the cool season, we're putting it in earlier, we're taking it off earlier, we're giving ourselves more opportunity to capture that 96% and utilize more regrowth days, as well as an earlier maturity for a cutting date if that's something that fits your operation as far as being able to fit better with your plans for the summer and things that you have going on within the context of your farm. This here, as much as the dates are listed, don't necessarily pay attention to the dates as much as the soil temperature. So we look here, 8 degrees soil temperature. You're in that prime category for C3 and C4 plants. They're all going to have equal opportunity to sunlight coming out of the ground, all being able to capture that efficiently and utilize it. So we look at our canopy here. We have that nice layering that we talked about. We have those high risers, those sorghum, the millets, the sunflowers going up over top, capturing that sunlight. We have our oats, peas, triticale, soft white wheat hanging on underneath, not having that direct sunlight. Those C4s are giving them that little bit of shade, but still giving them opportunity to capture it. And then we have our lower growing vegetative plants, our Italian ryegrass, our turnips, our radishes, and our sunlight opportunities, our vetch sprinkled in throughout. So we just able to have all those plants express themselves when we're able to get that seeding date, seeding temperature proper and give them a good chance to start off in the spring. And we look here at the end, 10 to 12 soil degrees. So we look here, a full season cover crop, similar to the situation I had my first year. We're just going to see a predominant canopy of warm season plants. So at that point, we might as well put ourselves in a better position, put a higher percentage of C4 plants in the ground, being able to utilize water more efficiently and being able to withstand that heat and really have that maximum photosynthesis at that heat. So just putting those plants in a position to be able to succeed just based off the soil temperature of what we're going into. And going back to that graph that Chance talked about, we look here, that warm season peak, that midsummer heat, when we're probably experiencing some drier conditions, and we want those plants to be more water efficient. Similar to what Chance brought up on the full season cover crop, as you can see, we still do have C3s in place on the warm season cover crop. Now, why do we have that? Going back to this, we want to raise that floor. We want to be able to give those plants an opportunity. If it's a cool, wet summer, we have those C3s in place, being able to utilize that and be able to grow within that environment. But if it goes hotter, we have those higher percentage of C4s in place to be able to utilize that and ultimately probably dominate a lot of the canopy and make up a large proportion of what the crop's going to be. So we're just giving that diversity. We're able to raise that floor and give ourselves options based on the environmental conditions that are happening on our farms. Like I talked about, C4 plants are more water efficient. I don't know if I love the wording of drought tolerant. They definitely need water to grow, but they are much more water efficient than what a C3 plant is. Their optimum daytime temperature is 30 plus degrees Celsius. As you can see with the millet and the sorghum, they both have a waxy leaf coating, giving them a bit of protection. That works in a couple ways. Obviously, a bit of protection from that high heat and that sun, making them more water efficient. But also, if they're in a swath or something like that, the water kind of repels off them in that sense. So they're not soaking in the plant. If they're in a swath, we're going to have less waste. We're going to have less spoilage. But like I said at the beginning, when I was talking about the soil temperatures, the C4 plants have almost zero frost tolerance in the spring or in the fall. So that's just something to be conscious of when we're thinking about when we're putting a blend in. Are we going to be going very early? We're probably going to want to be staying away from those C4 warm season plants, instead relying heavily on our C3s. That ties right into the swath grazing. Like I talked about, that waxy leaf coating obviously is very advantageous in a swath. So it's going to repel some of that water. We're not going to have as much spoilage. We're not going to have as much waste laying down in that swath. Sometimes we're going out there, start of September, end of August, knocking that down. So there is an extended period of time that'll be laying down. We wanted to maintain that quality, and we wanted to maintain that good feed value for those animals that'll be going on there. It's a story from Manitoba. This is on Owen Taylor's farm. So Owen had an old hay stand. He took a cut of hay off it and went in, terminated the hay crop, and then actually seeded a warm season cover crop into it. As you can see there at the top, accumulated rainfall at that time was 16 millimeters. So they were going into very dry conditions. They got very fortunate and did receive some rainfall, ended up with 143 millimeters. Now, where they weren't so fortunate is what came along before the rainfall, and that was the grasshoppers. So the grasshoppers came through this warm season cover crop, and they took every single plant except the sorghum. The sorghum and the forage pea will be the last two plants that a grasshopper will go after. So this is just showing where diversity always wins. In a monocrop setting, the cereal going into this hayfield, it would have looked exactly the same as it does in the first picture. But he had that diversity in place. And we've actually seen some creative producers across Saskatchewan that are actually going on their annual crop ground acres, and they're seeding a perimeter of sorghum to try to mitigate some grasshopper impact there that they've had in past years. So as you can see, just diversity here, winning in a situation like this and still giving options moving forward. One of the benefits to sorghum as compared to corn, obviously related in the same family there, but the one advantage sorghum does have is its lower lignin. Now, why is that? A corn plant has a big cob, and it needs to hold up that big cob and that weight, so there's more lignin within that plant. Lignin is harder for cattle to digest. With lower lignin in sorghum, it's easier to digest for cattle and be able to utilize as a feed source. So something that is, we're seeing more and more with the sorghum is just being able to utilize it as a feed source across farms, and really a very valuable feed source. Still being able to get some biomass off those plants and utilize and be more efficient in that C4 capacity. All right, now I'm going to try not to go down too far of a rabbit hole. I touched on it a bit at the start there, but what we're doing when we're putting in a multi-species cover crop, like we've talked about tonight, is we are really introducing and we're stimulating that fungi in that soil. So that is something that is happening beneath our soils, and it's really being biologically active. That fungi is working really together very well. It's forming that relationship. So how can we look to benefit this in following years if we're using it on an annual cropland rotation, similar to kind of how I'm using on my farm? So I'm looking at plants like flax, corn, wheat, barley, oats, all very mycorrhizal dependent plants. Really, the start of Earth as we know it started with mycorrhizal fungi and the creation of mycorrhizal fungi. We would not have nature as we know it without it. So, how can we start to feed this fungi that's happening beneath our soils? I'll share a quick story from my farm. Last year, we seeded some corn. So, we had some acres that were seeded with a corn planter. Some of those acres were canola acres, while others were cover crop acres. Now, the cover crop acres at my dad's place is actually on a U-pick strawberry farm. It's a 5-acre plots, is what it was. It was in the 80s. It's all fenced off, so we weren't going to take the corn planter in there. So we went in with our 1985 Morris drill with the dual chute openers on 12-inch spacings, put the grazing corn in. But then we had right beside it, where we had the canola last year, a non-mycorrhizal dependent plant. And we put the corn in there. And the 1985 Morris drill actually showed better results throughout the entire growing season. But I attribute that all to the fungi that was present in the soil. When that corn went in on the canola ground, it wasn't stimulated, it wasn't as active as it was in the cover crop ground. But instead, when it went into that cover crop environment, that relationship was present, it was active, and it was ready to roll and form it with the corn. And for that, it really got off to a great start and really put on a great grazing corn crop for us last year on those 5-acre plots.
So fertilizer is always a big question too. We've learned over the years, myself, I've never fertilized my cover crop. But that's just my choice as well. And some folks don't want to do that, right? Um, we've seen I've seen a lot of folks go nothing, and I've seen people put the full kit at it. The biggest thing that we've noticed is not necessarily in yield, but if we have a stressful year, a little bit of fertilizer helps those plants get up and get going to start with, get that canopy formed and help them um, get the ground covered and be able to survive a little better. So big thing is if we're applying nitrogen, we want to stay below 40 pounds an acre actual, and phosphorus, we'll keep it under 10 pounds an acre actual. With the nitrogen, we don't want to make our legumes lazy. We want them nodulating. We want them working. That's the big point of having them in an annual blend. And the phosphorus, we just worry about some seed burn there with the smaller seeds and that kind of stuff, right? Um, so as you can see here, this is a total nutrient extraction and it's taken from farms across Manitoba, Saskatchewan, North Dakota. Michael Teal and Blaine Jurdis did this research there with Sask Soils. Um, they it's like phosphorus is one that really sticks out to me all the time. Um, Obviously, that 2,300 pounds an acre is not going to be plant available. It's there, it's trapped within our soil structure, it's bonded. But that's the reason for some of these plants that we have within our blends. Buckwheat, flax, those plants, what their superpower, I call it, is to solubilize phosphates. So they use root exudates and they make small amounts of phosphorus plant available throughout the growing season. Um, and different plants within the blend and everything like that have different root exudates, and they'll be making different nutrients of plant available, right? Also, the nodulators are going to be producing nitrogen, fixing nitrogen. But as you can see within our soils, we have a lot of this stuff there. We just need to find a way to be able to utilize even a small fraction of it. So recommendations for seeding, 3/4 of an inch to an inch deep. We want to make sure we're getting that good seed to soil contact. Pre-burn glyphosate pass, if any weed pressure exists. I mean, obviously, if you're organic, that's not an option. It's, tillage or whatever other practices that you're going to be using there. Minimal disturbance. If we can trigger less weed seed germination by using less disturbance, obviously that's ideal. One thing I always stress is early weed pressure on these crops is a killer. If you wouldn't go out there and plant corn or canola, um, I wouldn't plant this crop there. If you're going out onto the dirtiest field that you own, you're not going to be happy with the results. The crop needs a good chance in that first few weeks to get established under low pressure environments, get those leaves out, get them getting some sunlight with minimal pressure to ensure its success. It's a lower seeding rate to begin with, and we want them to canopy out, right? And our Endure, it's a multi-strain rhizobium inoculant. It covers all the legumes in the blend. Um, it's so from your peas to your vetch, everything in there is covered by this inoculant.
Yeah, and it's just a powder form there. So the way we put it on our farm, we just sprinkle it on as we're loading the totes, sprinkle the powder on as it's going up the drill and just mix it in and it's good to go.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean in my application I use a box drill, so I'll layer in some seed, layer in some inoculant, give it a little swirl around and repeat the process till we're full, right? Uses on the farm. We have ourselves, we've done quite a bit as dry hay. We do a lot as silage bales as well, but seeing a growing number of people doing it in dry hay application, um, treat it like a heavy green feed crop. 7 to 10 days dry down time. You're gonna want to have a good weather window. Put a good crimp on the swaths. Do not use a swather, or well, unless you can get 20 days of good drying time, I guess. But there's lots of plants in there that are going to hold moisture if you don't put a good crimp on them. Lay it as wide as possible. Some are even laying it right flat and come with a rake afterwards and fluff it up into a swath. But it might have to be flipped as well. Just some dry bales there in the field. Silage, we've got a really wide silage window. We touched on this a little bit before. Um, just depending on what you want for an outcome, whether you're targeting higher protein or higher energy. But it's not like a straight cereal silage where if you hit your staging, you've got 2 or 3 days to get out there or you're going to miss your staging. We have that week or 10-day window. And I think Dakota can attest to that because I strong armed him into coming to my crop tour this summer when he was wanting to be cutting his full season cover there, and I think it still worked out for you, hey?
Yeah, that was actually this field here. So as you can see, the barley and the peas were starting to turn on me, and it was very worth going. But that's the thing is stuff like this happens on the farm, whether it's a family events or whether it's machinery breakdowns or work commitments. But we went out there, still got very, very good quality out of this, even with the barley and oats turning. Whereas if I would have had a straight barley crop out there, I would have been past my stage and it would have been too late to gain the proper quality out of it. So looking at that, like Chance talked about, 2 week window there that we can really, target as far as still being able to get really good silage quality out of it and allow us some options on our farm for other things to happen as well too.
Just that it comes down to the diversity. Your cereals are going to be ripening off, but you're still going to have a lot of vegetative green plants there growing within the canopy, and it just gives you that extra time, right? you're able to stretch it out. You're able to not compromise a lot on feed quality, even while stretching out that timing.
Absolutely.
Grazing, lots of folks using it in grazing applications, whether that's mob grazing or wholesale. Obviously there's a lot of different styles that people graze, whether they're moving cattle in 1 day moves or multiple times a day or once a week. But it is becoming more and more popular as far as grazing goes. And if it's well managed, you can get at least three grazes out of a piece in a year, right? Well managed, and you get some weather cooperation, right?
Yeah. Well, that's something we're doing on our farm this year with some of our annual cropland acres, just with the current state of things, is just doing some straight grazing. Having some more animals on the farm this year and planning to move them through. I'm looking for a 2-pass system for sure, and then see what the fall brings as far as potentially a fall graze there, but really trying to target it earlier in the growing season. So trying to target around that 50 days rather than we're looking at a silage window of probably 60 to 70 days maturity. We're looking to take it post germination. So looking to take it earlier, keep those plants vegetative, and try to move my animals through at a quicker rate on the first pass, and then utilize heavier on the second pass.
Yeah. And with the cool season too, it's something I think is pretty neat is if you can get out right at the start of May, get it in the ground, and you can have grazing for, June 1st or even mid-June to kick those animals out onto, and away you go. So feed analysis, um, it's something we're seeing. Like on my farm, we've seen very good, very nice results with the balance in quality on the feed analysis. We're seeing a good balance between protein and energy. Um, I don't know, you have the first one up. There we go. Um, so this one was taken earlier, so it's higher protein. Um, I believe this was a dairy farm. Or no, but it was taken earlier, so they were targeting a little higher protein. That's typically if you're taking it green vegetative, that's what you're going to be going after is that protein content. I like to go a little bit kind of catch in the middle, so we're, balanced with the protein and energy. But with the high protein, I gotta move my
Oh yeah.
toolbar. See anything?
And this one here too, like if a lot of environmental conditions would have went very well.
Yeah,
So you would have had heavy component of legumes. The moisture wouldn't have been the limiting factor. Really, the field would have been exactly what you were hoping for, and the environment worked exactly in your favor. So we put this in as kind of the high range, just to give a potential of where it could possibly be with all things going well. And then we kind of put in maybe the more average that we've seen, and then we've seen maybe on the lower end, which is actually that field out of Ceylon, Saskatchewan, where moisture was absolutely a limiting factor. The timing was right, but just weren't able to get that legumes kind of going. So
yeah, yeah. Just same crop, taking a little different staging, maybe a little different weather conditions. Protein's a little lower. TDN is still, very nice at mid 60s. Just to me, that right there is optimal for feeding to bred cows. I would use that almost as a standalone ration, right?
and that's probably for me the more average feed test I'm seeing, and kind of the research role that I'm in is kind of seeing that right there in that ballpark that we're seeing on this feed test result here.
Yeah. Yeah, and a little bit lower on the lower end in protein, still quite acceptable. TDN is mid 60s again, 66 and a half. Like even on a little bit lower protein, it's a super feed source, right? So forage soybeans, I touched a little bit on it earlier, just with the intercropped into corn, but what we're using here is a long season forage soybean. These aren't like your grain soybeans. These are an extremely long season. I believe they're 170 or 180 day bean. We will never see them in our climate make pods. And that's the goal. We want them to be green. We want them to be vegetative, nodulating, late into the season, right? Um, so something that we're seeing, couple different options, I guess, going in seeding your corn with the plant, or going in seeding your beans first, either with a an air drill. You can go in and solid seed them, and then coming in with your planter afterwards and seeding your corn. Important to note, it's got to be seeded. Your corn has to be seeded north and south to provide good light access, sunlight access to those beans underneath. The other thing that we can do is seed our corn, say on a 30-inch space, north and south. If you've got the GPS equipment, you can move over 15 inches and you can seed your beans in between the row with the planter as well.
And the other thing to mention too, Chance, like they are Roundup ready beans.
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
So
So it gives you that chemical option as well.
yeah, yeah. You don't have to change your program. This is a cool project. Joe Gardner, he's our one of our founders. He is a baseball fanatic. And they decided to do a cool project this year. This is Field of Dreams. If you've seen the movie with Kevin Costner, they built their own Field of Dreams in a corn and soybeans field. They got three senior baseball all-star teams from throughout Manitoba, and they did an all-star one-day round robin tournament. And when they did their final, they did walk out of the corn. So it was a neat project. They raised I believe $60,000 for their local community foundation, for the Clearwater Foundation. And it just, one thing that we stress is we are very motivated and very passionate about the communities that we operate in, and being involved in the rural communities. We want to be involved in community events, and if you have projects going on, it's something that we would like to be a part of. Their fancy scoreboard that they built on the edge of the corn and the beans, and you can just see underneath the beans have gone wild in that corn. So that's a nice little video of them chopping. You can see the corn has long since turned color. It's ready to go in the pit, but it's provided that protection for those beans underneath, um, so that they're protected from the frost and they're remaining vegetative for longer into the season. Uh, and they're leaving a little bit of beans behind with the chopper, which is all right. It can be utilized either through biomass going to the soil, back to the soil, or if you're able to turn some livestock, some cattle out there and graze afterwards, you can still capitalize on that. Once again, you can see the beans just kind of down low, what's been missed with the chopper. They're getting quite a bit, but just the nature of the bean, they're down low. They might not get them all, but like I say, I wouldn't be afraid of it, whether it's whether it's soil armor, and biomass going back to the soil, or if you can get some animals out there and get some more grazing days out of it. So on the left, you've got your grain soybeans. You can see just a finer structure. They're going to go into reproduction quite early in the season. So they're going to start putting that energy into making pods and not producing biomass. On the right, we've got our forage soybeans here, and they're just going to continue to be indeterminate. They're going to continue to shoot off shoots, make leaves, make vines, and produce that biomass throughout the year.
The other thing I'll touch on there, Chance, too, is just that grain soybean versus that forage soybean. We talked about it earlier in the presentation, but just the energy flow. So when that soybean, that we're going to see in a couple slides, actually, what the nodulation difference is, but that really comes back to that energy flow. When that grain soybean hits reproduction, summer solstice, its energy is going up. It's creating a pod where we have something like the forage soybean that isn't hitting that. It's continuing to pump energy beneath the soil for deep into the fall, until there's a killing frost that ultimately terminates it. And for us, that's the big thing with the forage soybean is keeping that energy flow, feeding that root exudates, and feeding that biology.
Yeah, just capturing that sunlight longer into the year.
Yeah.
So there's just some some research trials with using field view, and all this is showing is showing biomass. Uses satellite imagery to show biomass, and you can see everywhere where the beans were within the trial, there's just quite simply more biomass there. It's quite noticeable in a few of the trials actually, just how much it is. Seeing a nice little increase in protein within corn silage. I mean, and that's always one of the detriments of corn silage is it is lower protein, right? So if we can get that little bump there, it sure helps. So 1%, 1.5% on average increase over monocrop corn. And you see nice that lots of green in there from the beans within that corn silage. This is the big one. Like Dakota was saying, that nodulation late into the year. Look at the size of those. That's the grain soybean there on the left. Kind of sparse nodules. On the right, we've got the forage soybean. Just with it being vegetative longer, going longer into the year, or sorry, that's the grain soybean in the second half of that video. Um, it's putting that energy down and it's capturing that nitrogen and storing it in those nodules. This is some soil tests that we did on the beans and the corn. So this is a 30-inch space, and this one wound up being at 27 parts per million. So just over 50 pounds of nitrogen that this bean crop fixed prior or post corn. We got a 60-inch. One thing to note with the 60-inch is there was a slight yield reduction in the corn going to the 60-inch spacing, but we nearly doubled the amount of nitrogen that it fixed, 49 parts per million, so just shy of 100 pounds of N, um, which is crazy to me after a corn crop.
All comes down to context, right?
Yep.
Context, farm, and what fits it.
Yeah. And it might not always be the case, but even if there's a chance that we can see something like that, just think of the opportunity you have on the next year's crop with input reduction, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Salinity, I'm sure it's a hot topic in a lot of areas across the province. And I think the one thing that we're seeing with salinity is, just these bare areas. So what are these bare areas meaning to these farms? What are they meaning to these areas? So what we're seeing in salinity is we're seeing, we're possibly getting a crop established. It's coming out in the spring. It'll keel over, it'll die, it won't quite make it. So what we're actually having is we're having these roots get established in these soils, and then we have these high salt soils underneath, and we have our roots underneath. We have our water molecules attaching to our roots, and we have that salt coming in and essentially dehydrating that plant throughout the growing season. So we're just needing to find plants that can ultimately grow in these areas. Now, what's the one key factor when it comes to salinity as far as really remediating these areas and making them productive on our farms again? It's water infiltration. That is what we have to achieve with these areas. Now, what is the key to water infiltration? We need to get plants growing. So we need to be able to establish a root system so we can properly infiltrate water, because what's happening now, we have this bare soil. We have the high salt content in the soil underneath. It's being sucked up as this high heat's coming down. It's pulling it up and up. As it comes up and up, we're seeing it spread out. That's why we're seeing these saline areas spread and spread, ultimately impacting more acres on our farms. So what we need to do, we need to get plants growing, and we need to infiltrate water. So this graph here will show on the annual side why we are maybe combating some of these areas. And it all comes down to your EC tolerance of the plants that we're putting in place. We look at something on the annual side that's not bad, something like a rye, a barley, and oats. They tolerate salinity fairly well for an annual plant. And then we move over to our legumes, our flax, even our wheat. all being plants that really struggle to tolerate the EC in these soils. So that's exactly what we're talking about when I started at the beginning there about the roots being dehydrated and just not being able to live within these areas and really get that water infiltration necessary for these areas to be productive on our farms. So where are we going to see the highest EC tolerance? We're going to see it on the perennial side. So we need to look at perennial plants that can have a high EC tolerance that can withstand these areas. So we're going to look to our wheat grasses. We're going to look something like a white sweet clover, salt tolerant alfalfa. We're going to put these plants in place as they can tolerate the factors that are happening in these areas when it comes to the EC levels in these soils. And we're able to get growth and we're able to get competition. What's the first thing we see in a lot of these salinity areas? We're seeing weeds. So we need to be able to have something to give competition against those weeds, to start to fill the role of a plant within that environment to be able to survive, and more importantly, get that water infiltration happening in our soils. So together, we need to start to work on these areas through a perennial landscape scope, and we need to try to get the water infiltrating through the root structures, creating those channels, creating those networks to push those salts down lower within the soil profile. So moving here, this is our salinity cover. As we talked about, high component of wheat grasses. We have the white sweet clover, salt tolerant alfalfa. Russian wild rye is actually extremely high. As you can see here, 5.9 EC tolerance. So we're really trying to target plants in these areas that can withstand the environmental conditions they're facing and still be able to grow and still be able to infiltrate that water. Perennial hay cover. This is a field up in Bredenbury, Saskatchewan. We had a full season cover crop at a reduced rate, so 40 pounds an acre of full season cover crop. Normal seeding rate is 60, so we cut it at 2/3. And then they actually seeded the heavy land hay cover in this situation. So together we had, I think, close to 28 species growing in this field. So just maximum biodiversity. This is an area, another marginal acres project that was actually happening. So this was a grain farm that turned these acres over, constantly fighting weeds in the spring. So decided to put it down into perennials and utilized plant diversity to kind of achieve their goal for that competition and still be able to gain an income source on these acres through the perennial forage coming off it. So we look at something like our perennial cover light land. So we're going to have a higher percentage of alfalfa. Now, the big thing with these, with the light land, is its water is most likely going to be the limiting factor on where you're putting this. So that's why we're looking to target a higher percentage of alfalfa. We're looking around that 50% alfalfa. Obviously, we have the bird's foot trefoil in there at a 5%. So we're close to 55% legumes on this blend. As well, we have our grasses. So this is designed for 1 to 2 cuts and then grazing after a hard frost. But really, when we look at the light land, if water is the limiting factor, most likely this would be the best of the options that we have to put you in a position for some good perennial forage. Moving over to the heavy land, having the reduction in alfalfa composition, so moving down from that 50% down to 30%. As well, we have red clover introduced here and a higher percentage of bird's foot trefoil. So we are still having those legumes in there. We want those water tolerant legumes, ensuring the protein and feed source are being produced under a variety of conditions. Like I said, in a situation like this, water is most likely not your limiting factor, whether it's heavier soil, holds on to water better, or just more moisture in your region altogether. This would be designed for 2 cuts and a grazing after a hard frost. Rejuvenation cover. I got to give a huge shout out here to Connor English, our Manitoba Territory Manager. Connor has spent a ton of time designing the perennial rejuvenation cover as well as the pasture cover, as well as lots of trials and research on his own operation and farms around him. So this is 100% perennial and biannual legumes, and this is meant to go into older pastures, tired hay stands, possibly if you're looking at grazing, and we're trying to increase the diversity in these. Now, I want to be very clear on this, and I think this is the most important part. It's going to take some planning to have a project with a rejuvenation cover. To have 160 acres that you just let the cattle go out on every year, then you're going to spread some rejuvenation cover on it, and the cattle are just going to stay out there. You're just not going to be setting yourself up for a good opportunity to succeed in that area. What we're going to see happen, that pasture is probably tired. There's a high component of grasses in there. This nice new legume is going to be popping up, And then all of a sudden, it's going to be coming. It's going to be nice. It's going to be fresh. It's going to be green. And that cow is going to come and at a very vulnerable state, it's going to be taking it. So what we're trying to do, we need to have proper management. We need to have patience. We need to give these legumes that we're putting in there a chance to get established, that root network to be formed, and put these in a position for multiple years moving ahead that we can utilize this pasture more efficiently with the implementation of these legumes. The other thing with this, we have seen a lot of interest on the drone seeding. So this is meant to be drone seeded if you so choose, as well as broadcast or drilled in. The other one to kind of introduce is the pasture cover. So this is designed to work in a variety of systems, whether it's the intensive grazing or more traditional grazing system. What we've done with this, moving off the light and heavy land, one of the feedback we got, something as a company we always try and do is have conversation with producers, have conversation with our dealers. What's the feedback in these areas? There was some current concern over the high content of legumes in the blends. So what we wanted to put together is a pasture cover that still has a high component of legumes in it. But what we're doing is introducing those as a more of a low bloat risk option with the Sicer milk vetch, sandfoin, and bird's foot trefoil. So we're trying to introduce those in a setting where we're not having as much of that bloat risk, but we're still getting that legume content as we still believe in the diversity of legumes and what they can bring to a pasture setting. So like I said, can be used in a stockpiled situation or in-season grazing, but just trying to give more options to producers out there looking at utilizing plant diversity. As well, this year, we'd have individual seeds available. So we'd have sorghum Sudan grass, hairy vetch, German millet, Italian ryegrass, forage peas, and winter triticale available on the individual seed side, as well as the forage soybean that Chance talked about there earlier. Lastly, we're going to talk about is our on-farm research. So it's something that I've kind of taken on here as a role within the company in the past year or so, is looking after some of the on-farm economic analysis, as well as gaining some more feed test data across the prairies. So this past year, like I talked about at the very beginning of the presentation, something very important to me as a young producer is being economically profitable. And I really, really believe in cover crops being economically profitable on farms across the prairies. And I wanted to gain more information and more resources for producers to be able to access that. So we started this year with six farms for the on-farm economic analysis, 2 in Alberta, 3 in Saskatchewan, and 1 in Manitoba. So what we did is we tried to put everything all together to give a true cost as to what it is to produce a cover crop on a farm in Western Canada. So Chance was actually part of our study there this year. We also had some across Saskatchewan, like I was talking, 2 other sites in Asquith and Ceylon. And what we did is we came in and we looked at every single cost associated to that project. So we put it in as our inputs for our seed and inoculant that was based on the March 15th pricing. Fertilizer was a true cost. So if a producer chose to put fertilizer in there, what was the true cost of the fertilizer to put in there? And then where we got creative with it, because each farm across the prairies is going to be different, what we did with the other costs were based it on a custom rate. So even though my 1985 Morris drill, as much as I maybe think it's worth $35 an acre, it's probably not. But for the purpose of a research, if my farm were to be a part of it, it would be signed a custom rate value of $35 an acre. So the costs in these projects are basically saying if someone came in and you paid them custom rate value to do every single part of this operation, as far as producing a cover crop, that is the value that would be assigned to these inputs. So the custom costs we looked at were seeding, sprayer cost, labor. Something as producers we don't do very well is think that we need to be paid a wage. So how many hours did you spend out there? What was your custom rate of labor? Disc bine, if that was what you used, or hay bine. Baler, what was the cost per bale? Silage wrapper, if you were using it in Chance's situation for a silage wrapper. We also had producers that used it as tube silage. So we've calculated the custom rate of a silage operation and how much that cost per acre. As well, we had in there the cost of chemical, and then the one that fluctuated a bit, as it will across our province, is land cost. But basically, having a conversation with the producer, if this piece of land that we're having this project on was used, it was rented out, sorry, what would be the value of that? So the other thing to kind of tie in with these projects is they had to be isolated in the sense that they had to be fenced off. And when the cattle got turned out there for regrowth grazing, the only thing they had access to was cover crops. The water source either had to be within that field or it had to be in about a 0.5 acre chunk outside the field. It couldn't have 10 acres of pasture beside it. They were grazing. It strictly had to be on the cover crop regrowth. So looking at values as much as often as possible, we went off the Saskatchewan custom rate guide for the value of feed. And we calculated that as far as what was the weight or tonnage that came off that field. And then we looked at the feed replacement cost. So how we calculated the feed replacement cost and how does that come in? Essentially, it was the regrowth grazing. So in Chance's situation, Chance had 3 groups that went out there, correct, Chance? Yeah. So he had 3 groups that went out there at separate dates. So I got an approximate weight of the animals and the calves. I was actually fortunate enough, Chance sold a lot of calves off that field. So we had a very true weight of what was going on there, as well as the cows were a true weight as a couple of those were on. So we had the cost of the animals, or sorry, the weight of the animals, and then we calculated that out to an animal unit. So how many animal units per acre were we grazing across these fields? At that point, with the animal units calculated, one animal unit was eating 30 pounds of dry matter per day. So we calculated that on our feed value. We didn't include machinery, labor, or any other winter feed costs, because if you're not grazing cover crops in a situation like Chance, most likely your winter feeding program is starting. So we just based it off the feed replacement cost. How much feed does that animal need during that time frame? Other things we looked at is environmental conditions. So what was the monthly precipitation? We broke it down, and you'll see through the reports online, there were certain cases that we highlighted. This was a very wet stretch. This was a very dry stretch, but we have it broken down by month as well as soil type and location. The big thing for me creating these is making them available to producers. So we actually have these on our website on the on-farm research blog. So we'll see Chance's studies up there as well as the other ones across Saskatchewan. We have 2 more to get out, one in Manitoba and one out in Alberta, an irrigation project that they actually swath grazed the regrowth. And I was still getting pictures last week, end of February, that they're still swath grazing the regrowth of the full season cover crop. So really for me, just putting together some information and some data to be able to provide for producers moving ahead as far as the economic analysis of a full season cover crop. Other things to touch on is the funding availability out there. The Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds has announced that they have received funding for the upcoming year. They haven't been able to release details yet, and they're still kind of working those out. But definitely to keep in mind, last year they had nitrogen management, cover crops, and rotational grazing under their funding program, and they have announced that that has been extended till 2028 through the SWEEP program, is who they're now running it through the Saskatchewan Association of Watersheds. So if it's something of interest to you, definitely get in contact with them. They are great resources and will definitely be more than happy to help you there. As well as the Ministry of Agriculture, Ducks Unlimited have some great tame forage and marginal acres programming out as well. Definitely encouraged to reach out to those organizations and get in touch. As well as CFGA has also announced that they have received off-calf funding for some rotational grazing plans and infrastructure, as well as some different projects within those plans that are being created. And I know I threw a lot at you guys, and me and Chance very much appreciate you guys joining us here tonight. But we'd like to open it up there for questions now, and just anything that you guys would like to bring up, we'd be more than happy to discuss and have a conversation about.
For sure. Fire away.
If there's no questions, we can let you guys get on with your night. Feel free to reach out to Chance or myself. Both of our contact info is on the website there, and be more than happy to have a chat with you guys and answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, thank you very much for everybody coming out tonight.